Okay, well, hello everyone, as you're still coming in. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith with Kaitlyn Greenidge and Brandon Taylor. My name's Alex. I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here tonight. If this is the first time that you're visiting us or that you have even heard of us, welcome to our community. Thank you for being part of us tonight. And thank you all for supporting an incredible author and also an independent bookstore with your purchases and your attendance. The chat and the question boxes are both open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember, if you want to chat to your fellow attendees, set your chat to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you'll only be speaking to the 3 people that you can see right now, and they may be busy. So that is an important tip. And also, if you have any questions for Kaitlyn, make sure that those go in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. That's the best way for us to keep track of them so they don't get lost in the chat and you have a better chance of getting your question answered at the end of the night. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Now, tonight's event is one that I have been literally excited about for literal months. Kaitlyn Greenidge and Brandon Taylor are 2 of the most remarkable fiction writers to have appeared on the literary scene in the last few years. Brandon's debut novel, Real Life, is a taut and uncompromising study of a queer Black young man carrying the burdens of his life and, the basic terrors of being alive into a place that punishes everything about him, e.g. grad school. Brandon's ability to turn every phrase and observation in a book towards his central point, the essential mood and spirit of his work, is stunning. He has a second book releasing soon. The short story collection Filthy Animals releases on June 22nd. You should all check that out. I'm very excited about that book. And I'm excited for him to be here tonight. He's an incisive but generous critic and with exceptional taste. And I'm not just buttering you up. I've been reading your reviews. You really know your stuff. So it's just so awesome to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for being the moderator and welcome. Now I'm thrilled that I can begin Kaitlyn Greenidge's introduction with congratulations. In case anyone is not aware, this morning she was announced as a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow. It's wonderful news and just great to see Kaitlyn's work acknowledged and supported on an even broader stage. Kaitlyn's debut novel, We Love You, Charlie Freeman, was one of the New York Times Critics' top 10 books of 2016 and a finalist for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times, and her writing has also appeared in Vogue, Glamour, The Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. And her new novel, Libertie, is a great book. It's a wonderful piece of historical fiction and an exemplary coming-of-age novel. It does what not all writing manages to do, no matter how hard it tries, which is that every character and every new addition or location or separate moment is like a mirror against all of the others. Nothing is allowed to be seen from just one angle or as the only angle. The weight of her characters take on different meaning as they move through the book. The weight of their histories and countries take on different heft as she layers these histories and legacies and lands alongside and on top of each other, line by line and moment by moment. And carrying all of that is Libertie Sampson, a narrator whose steady, curious, stubborn, and hungry voice draws you through page after page, bringing you with her as she grows and thinks and keeps a constant eye on becoming what and who she wants to be. This book is just beautifully written. It's a smart and deft book that both walks on solid ground and soars. It's a good thing to have out in the world. It's a great book to read, and it's my pleasure to welcome the author here tonight to share a little bit more about it with all of us. Please give your warmest welcome to Kaitlyn Greenidge and Brandon Taylor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to do about a very short reading, like the first 2 paragraphs of Libertie, and then Brandon and I are gonna get to it and discuss and get going. So these are the opening paragraphs of Libertie. This takes place in 1859, 1860, and it's told from Libertie's point of view. I'll just read this part. I saw my mother raise a man from the dead. It still didn't help him much, my love, she told me, but I saw her do it all the same. That's how I knew she was magic. The time I saw Mama raise a man from the dead, it was close to dusk. Mama and her nurse, Lenore, were in the office. Mama with her little greasy glasses on the tip of her nose, balancing the books, and Lenore banking the fire. That was the rule in Mama's office. The fire was kept burning from dawn till after dinner, and we never let it go out completely. Even on the hottest days, when my linen collar stuck to the back of my neck and the belly of Lenore's apron was stained with sweat, a mess of logs and twigs was lit up down there, waiting. When the dead man came, it was spring. I was playing on the stoop. I'd broken a stick off the mulberry bush. So young, it had resisted the pull of my fist. I'd had to work for it. And once I'd wrenched it off, I stripped the bark and rubbed the wet wood underneath on the flagstone, pressing the green into rock. I'll stop there.
Ooh, oh my gosh, Kaitlyn. Oh, I love this book so much.
Thank you.
I
You were one of the earliest readers when we sent it out for blurbs. So yeah, thank you.
I think I got this book was one of the first things that I read right when I was sort of coming out of a really dark place and could not. It was one of the first books I was able to really get my head back around when I was coming back into the world. And it's really just because it is such a deeply beautiful, propulsive read. I just needed to know what was going to happen right around the bend on the next page and the next and the next. And I mean, you're just such an incredible storyteller. And so congratulations on
Thank you.
my first question is a bit, I guess, a bit of a general question. And it's, I think every piece of writing is it's in tension with an archive. In historical fiction, this tension is perhaps more explicit, if not on the page, then certainly in the mind of the writer and to some extent to the reader. And so I'm just wondering, what archives, both literal and maybe figurative, do you think of as being in tension or in conversation with Libertie? And how did you negotiate those tensions when you were writing the book?
That's a great question. So the archives that I sort of looked at were both probably like the biggest one that comes to mind right away is I was really lucky in that when I was researching the book, a scholar at Vanderbilt University had done all this work on Black expatriates who had left the US right after the Civil War and were going to Haiti as evangelical ministers. Essentially, they were going there to establish Protestantism in this Catholic country. And they wrote back to people sort of constantly. And so he published and was going through this archive. And those letters were so interesting because it was, it really sort of, I wanted the book to do this, and this sort of just underlined and gave me more purchose, I think, to do this, is that it sort of punctured that, I guess, myth around the utopia of another place outside of the US for Black Americans to go, where sort of like everything would be solved and better, because these people are writing back from the 1880s and they're bringing with them sort of all of their biases and mindset of having grown up in the US and under slavery to Haiti. And they want to like it. They believe in the potential of the country. They see the political potential of an all Black country succeeding, and yet their own sort of biases and anti-Blackness like keeps them from being fully there. And that was so interesting to me. Like, I think, Black history is so vast, and so much of it is really focused on how Black people contended with whiteness, but like this other thing of like how we contend with each other under this larger system oftentimes doesn't get as much attention or as deeper of a dialogue when there's so much richness there. So that was super interesting to me. And to that end, I went to the Schomburg and I found the travel journal of Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart's husband, the woman who Libertie's mother is based on. In real life, her husband had traveled to Haiti at a certain point because, like all sort of Black prominent abolitionists, he was super fascinated with the country, and people were constantly going back and forth between the two places. And so he went there in the 1870s, and he had this travel journal, and I got so excited to read it. I was like, can you imagine, like, literally the person connected to this is a travel diary. This is going to be so generative. And I got it, and it was completely unreadable. His scrawl is completely illegible. And then on top of it, it was from a what are those old timey machines called at the library? You know what I'm talking about? Where you're looking at like old newspapers on like a big.
Oh, yeah.
It was in that format. So it was really illegible. It was microfiche. Thank you. Yes. Everyone's like, microfiche. Yes. Thank you. It was on microfiche. So it just made it even more difficult to read. And all I had was he drew cartoons in the side. He would draw cartoons of the different trees and flowers that he was seeing. And that's all I could get out of that archive. So knowing that like sort of also opened up stuff to me, and I sort of let go of the idea of you know, like hewing directly to a historical record and really trying to discover the imaginations and the consciousness of these people and these characters in these worlds. You know, this book is in direct conversation with Saidiya Hartman's work, and she talks a lot about the archives and sort of the silences of the archives and having to do this imaginative work into the lives of people who are intentionally excluded from record. And that sort of informed that as well.
Oh my gosh. I was going to ask another question after that one, but this is so fascinating that I'm just going to like skip down to my sort of third or fourth question,
Okay.
which is, you know, I mean, I think what you say is so fascinating about like when oftentimes when you're like reading a book that's written in a more historical mode, and there's some writers who are like, I'm gonna get it all right, and like it's gonna be exact and precise. And like as a reader, you can tell, you know, like you can feel the kind of like, oh yeah, I feel all the work you did to get that exactly right. But I'm so interested in like, were there things in your research that you came across that were prompts to you, like that were sort of like, ooh, here's a thing I didn't expect, let me like find a way to move this in, or like what were the things that were generative? Because you talk about like the travel diary being this sort of like in your mind is like the platonic object that a researcher would want, and it wasn't what it turned out to, you know.
Yeah.
So what were the things that you didn't expect, that you didn't see coming, that were prompts in the making of the novel?
Yeah, a couple different things. So like one of them was also at the Schomburg, I found this, it's an unpublished memoir of a man writing about surviving the New York City draft riots. He was a student at the Colored Orphan Asylum in Manhattan that was specifically targeted by rioters because it was this Black philanthropic space. And his memoir is completely fascinating because his father was an escaped slave, and his mother was part of this multiracial family in Pennsylvania Dutch country, a Black Indian Pennsylvania Dutch family who had apparently like intermarried with all of these different people with very little violence against them. His mother had married this guy, and her sister married a Black man as well. And each of them had like 14 kids. And they sort of like had this crazy multiracial family in the middle of Pennsylvania Dutch country upbringing. And his memoir was super fascinating just because it was a moment of history that's a little bit untold, you know, like especially in terms of how I wanted to talk about colorism, he talked about coming from this multiracial family, you know, and both of his parents eventually passed away, so his cousins had to take him in, and his cousins were living in Brooklyn, and his cousin's family was light enough to pass, so they were able to go to public school because they were just going as white students. But he wasn't. So his cousins were sort of like, well, we don't have a way for you to get an education here because schools aren't segregated enough yet. And we're able to get our kids an education because they are white passing, but you are not. And so the family came up with the solution of putting him in the Colored Orphan Asylum. Even though he had a family, many of the people who were in there had families. It was more like a where are we going to get them educated kind of thing. And so all of that was super fascinating. You know, he's describing growing up in this orphanage. He's describing the day of the draft riots and slowly the rising fear of realizing you're living through a riot, which, you know, I think we've all sort of experienced in this last year, but like unfortunately we know that feeling right now. But when I was reading it then, it was very novel to me that's like slow dawning realization that, oh, there's violence, oh, it's getting closer, oh no, like what's coming. Sorry, sometimes I get crazy spam calls. But so that was super fascinating. And then, you know, he talks about coming out of making their escape from the Colored Orphan Asylum, looking around and realizing that the doors of all of the white sympathizers to the orphan asylum on the street had been marked with chalk by the rioters so that people knew who to attack, like which white people to attack. Yeah, it's like that level of stuff. And then he sort of, just lived this fascinating life and was in, you know, he's very modest about it. So then he'll just like mention in passing that Frederick Douglass was a close friend, or like that, you know, whatever, someone was like staying at his house or whatever. So all of that was good to get that feel of that world of how people were living through history and were very nonchalant about it. And it's so similar now, I think, to how my older relatives talk about living through history. I'm sure you've had this experience where you have an older relative and they'll just in passing be like, oh yeah, like Sammy Davis Jr. was like your aunt's ex or whatever. And you're like, what are you talking about? And they will just like drop you these things. So it was good to see that tradition has continued for sort of hundreds of years, this really sort of nonchalant way of interacting with and talking about history.
Black people undefeated with the oh yeah, I was there anecdote of it all. Like, oh my God. One time very quick anecdote. One time my grandma ran into one of her classmates in the Dollar General, and they were talking for like 30 hours. And I was like, oh my God, like, what were y'all talking about? And my grandma was like, oh yeah, we were just talking about that old Rosa lady. And I was like, what Rosa lady? She's like, Rosa Parks. And I'm like, oh, right. I live in Alabama.
Right.
Like, of course, my grandma.
Right, yes.
Yeah. And it's like, to me, Rosa Parks is like Rosa Parks. Like, she's in the textbooks. And my grandma's like, oh yeah, she was so annoying. So, I mean, it's just like like Black people undefeated with the dropping world historical anecdotes.
Yeah, and we are such a small percentage of the U.S. population when you actually break it down. So it kind of makes sense why it is like that, because when you're talking about the number of Black celebrities, the likelihood of people or Black people entering history, the likelihood of people having those connections probably go up. I imagine it's the same for other, smaller percentage ethnic groups where you're like, yeah, that person, who everybody knows, the wider world knows as X, is just like somebody's dusty high school boyfriend who we all knew about, and like we're all talking about. I imagine it's very similar for other communities, but it's just always funny when that happens, when just the nonchalance of it, you're.
Oh, yeah. I remember one time I was telling someone in Madison that like my brother's father was like this famous folk artist, and they were like, who? And I was like, oh yeah, Charlie Tin Man Lucas. And they're like, oh my God, he has a statue at this one place. And I like saw his statue, and I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna text my brother about his deadbeat dad's sculpture. And it turned out that guy was best friends with the woman who wrote about the 13 Goats of Jeffrey, like that whole series of like Southern ghost.
Oh, really?
It's a whole thing. I mean, anyway, Black people, iconic. And I guess like speaking of Black people, so something that animates this novel and like a lot of, I think, like the African-American literary tradition, are these twinned ideas of, first of all, this kind of porous boundary, this kind of potentiated realism, because Black people believe in ghosts and spirits. We just simply do. They walk among us. And it's just like a thing that is culturally in the water. So like a porous potentiated realism, and the idea of loved ones and family members who have been lost or spirited away. And it feels to me that in Black novels, particularly Black novels of family, there's a mournful kind of longing in them. And in Libertie, there's, the legend of the woman in the sea, and like all of Ben Daisy's, like, and of course, Libertie's dad is dead. And of course, like Libertie in essence becomes a kind of lost daughter to her mother when she leaves. And so it all sort of builds to this like beautiful kind of like call and response across the novel itself. And so I guess I just wonder, like, what is it about that dynamic that just feels like so deeply Black, like the sort of like longing for family and the sort of idea of family members being spirited away? And like, was that something that came up like in the course of your research, like even just going through the archive, this sort of longing that seems to permeate so much of our literature?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the legacy of slavery, right? It's the legacy of the family ties just being fundamentally broken and fundamentally perverted as well. Like when you think about the laws of slavery, which said, and the mother of a slave takes the legal definition of the mother, never the father, and that in itself, it all comes from that sort of longing and understanding of family. And I think it also comes from you know, two very or many different cultures, understandings of family meeting at once in the Americas. And how do you reconcile those things? How do you reconcile, you know, an emerging understanding of the family from Western, even as the Western world is figuring out that it is called the Western world and that it is something called the Western world, that at that same time, a definition of family is coming into the forefront that is much more narrow than it probably had been in generations past. And it's coming up against people who have been enslaved and are coming to this country with a completely different understanding of what and who makes family, and have been completely broken out of that culture, and oftentimes from the people who you know, hold that meaning for them, and so have to figure out how to remake it. And then also on top of it, you know, dealing with just the continual violence of living in this country, of constantly losing family members to larger scale violence. You know, it just, that longing comes through. And I think I think family is such a rich topic for novelists, just because the dynamics are already built in, and you can get so much from the words mother, father, child. You know, those words seem to all have the same definition for everybody, but when you dig a little bit deeper, they are so deeply personal, what those words and roles mean. So, you know, it's kind of like just a wonderful thing for a fiction writer to explore, because there's just so much to work with and unpack and build a world around there, and to build a conversation with a reader around, because of those the nature of those words and of those roles in our culture. Yeah, I think that's what I would say about that.
Oh my God, that's incredible. Your mind. I wish I could just live in your mind forever.
You don't want to be in here.
Well, maybe like a visit, a brief
yes,
visit.
a visit.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. Oh my gosh, you're so, oh my God. So Liberty is, to my mind, like such a classic American kind of character.
Mhm.
There's something so, I just kept being struck by like how very like Huck Finn she is, like
Yeah.
especially like with her chores, like she wants to be doing everything but like she's like, I don't want to be in this garden anymore. I need to get out of here. And so there is just like, so, and I do think that in the years to come, she's going to become an iconic, emblematic kind of character. I really feel that way. And so I guess I wonder, like, what was it like, and how did you sort of, how did you, how did you come to the idea that you wanted to write this like spirited, plucky, young Black girl, this young, dark-skinned Black girl, especially, who is being acted upon by all of these social forces? Like, how did you come to wanting to just like write a messy, complicated little girl who wants to shirk her duties and go on adventures and sing songs? I mean,
a couple of things. Sort of, you know, I'm always interested about writing about Black women and Black femmes. Like the Black femme space is very dear to my heart, and endlessly fascinating to me. And so I wanted to write about that. And I you know, I worked in Black history museums for about 10 years, for a long time, and did public history around Black history for a long time. And one of the things that would always occur, like I would always question, and oftentimes when you had school groups would sort of point or try and get at this question, is like, we know the exceptional people, we know the people who made it into history and sort of like beat the odds, but what about the people who like just didn't want to do that, or just couldn't do that? You know, like what about the people who maybe made it into you know, a newly founded Black college in the South, and then were like, actually, I really can't do this work, and had to drop out? Like, what about those people? And what would that have felt like in 1887 to be like, you know, I'm Kanye West, the college dropout, in the context of like post Reconstruction? What would that feel like? And for Liberty, like a really big in for me was Toni Cade Bambara talks a lot across a couple different essays and a couple different introductions to her books. She talks about how when she was a child, the greatest gift her mother gave her is that she would be lying on the kitchen floor, just daydreaming, and her mother would mop around her instead of asking her to get up. And so that was like another sort of image that wasn't into this character and into her mother and hers relationship, and into what a version of freedom would look like to her as a young girl, and sort of like the deep respect and care for a young girl's imagination in that moment, that I think, you know, I don't know that a lot of us actually experience as children often, was really sort of like an in into figuring out Liberty as a character.
Oh my goodness. That's, I guess, like related to that, and you've sort of touched the edge of this question, which is that Liberty and her mother have a very fraught, very complicated relationship as she is like trying to prepare Liberty for the life that she wants for her to have. And
Hmm.
it reminded me of a lot of the things that I saw in my own life, like my mom and my aunts and my grandma, like trying to prepare my girl cousins for various lives that the older generation wanted for them that the girls themselves were not. Which is like,
Yes.
I just want to jump rope. Like I don't um, and so it led to some really complicated, very fraught relationships, and they're relationships that I've known all my life, but like when it comes to the page, I don't often see reflected. Like very often, like I feel like when it comes to the leap to the page, relationships between Black women and their moms tends to be the sort of like noble brutality of it, and you don't really find that sort of those little notes of grace where you kind of understand where the mom's coming from and you're kind of understanding where the daughter's coming from, and it's very
Yeah.
complicated and they've got to figure it out, but you walk that line so beautifully here. And one of the ways that you walk that line is through letters. Like there are all these like really beautiful like epistolary modes and the novel as a whole, but especially between Liberty and her mother. And so like I guess my selfish greedy question is like how do you figure out the balance there of like making the relationships complicated and human and real and preserving a lot of the nuance from life,
Yeah.
and also figuring out how to do that with craft on the page, because especially like to do it the way that you do it, which is this sort of call and response, is not, I mean, is not an easy thing to do, and yet it feels, you know, because sometimes there's a temptation to sort of like throw it all in italics and be like, the reader will figure it out, but you really build that relationship over time, and it's really a marvel to witness.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful to hear. You know, you sort of like talked about that brutalism in motherhood, and also especially Black motherhood on the page. And you know, the novel starts with Liberty thinking that her mother is magic for a reason. You know, I really wanted to butt up against um that stereotype or that cliche of sort of like the magical Black mother who just against all odds after, you know, trauma after trauma after trauma is still just able to give and give and give and sort of like grow. And you know, much of the one of the journeys that happens in the novel for Liberty, at least in like her understanding, is coming to terms with the fact that that's not, that her mother is a person, that that's not her mother. Her mother is neither a saint, like she sort of thinks of her in the beginning, and she's also not the worst hypocrite in the world as she thinks of her sort of like later on, that she has to do that very quintessential part of coming of age, which is like recognizing that those who raised you are human beings, as yourself. The you know, the letter part of it, I was reading that poetry collection Olio, Tim Jess's collection that came out a few years ago, and he does a really beautiful thing where it's letters back and forth, and the letters start to braid together on the page, and the lines end up making sort of their own. Two letters come together. The lines of each letter are on top of each other, and they end up making a poem of their own. And I thought that's such a beautiful way to get at what I'm trying to do with this relationship, that they are their own sort of messages out into the air, and then when their voices come together, it makes itself as sort of like this third other thing. And so really, you know, say to it's all Olio, it's not me. I stole that craft from a poetry book. But you know, I thought about that a lot, of how to get that particularly onto a page for a reader to understand that that's their relationship between the two of them, and that's how they're going to attempt to connect and talk past each other sometimes.
It's brilliant. I loved it. I was like, oh my gosh, moms are so hard. It is so hard to have a mom so hard to be a mom. I don't know how anybody ever relates to another human being. I mean, it was such a feat, and it just, there's a very annoying truck man outside. Where are you? It's Iowa City. Why are you in a rush? Uh, it's just like one of the great marvels, and it brings me to my next question, which is that, like, Kaitlyn, like, this is a very svelte book, but it's really like 6 novels in one. It feels like. It's like it's a coming of age novel. It's kind of a campus novel. It's kind of a sapphic, like, music novel. It's also a novel about like women's reproductive rights. Like it's a novel about reconstruction and activism, and I guess, like, how did you find the shape of this novel? And was it something that you always knew, or was it something that you had to write your way into? And when can we expect the other 5 novels that will accompany this? Because I want a novel set in that hospital. Like, I want it. It's such a rich face and those horrible white ladies. It's a brilliant novel, and it is brilliantly structured. And I guess, could you talk a little bit about how you found the shape of it and how you shaped it?
Yeah, I when I knew that I wanted to write this a novel based on the life of Susan Smith McKinney Stewart and her daughter, their particular journey, the daughter getting married, figuring out the marriage was bad, and then the mother rescuing her. And so very early on, I think, like, when I was writing the pitch for the book, even, I think I was trying to find a story that I could hang that frame on, like a pre-existing story, so I could take out some of the work of figuring out the beats and then the action, and I could just sort of like focus on all this other stuff that needed to happen. And so a story that appeared and came into focus right away was the myth of Persephone, of Persephone and Demeter, and Persephone leaving her mother and going down to hell, and this whole part of that story of which is really, can be read many ways, and one of the ways of it being like this question of growing up for a girl or a woman, of exchanging maternal love for this other sort of deeper, more threatening love, and the maternal love sort of trying to get a revenge on that loss, constantly looking for you in the world once you've left. And so once I knew that, like, I just started to read as many versions of that myth as I could find, and that really helped as well to start to figure out what kind of characters that I could add in. So, like, right away, what became clear is that, like, there's a version of that myth that says Demeter is looking for Persephone everywhere, and she happens to meet these 2 sphinxes who are great singers, and they were the only people who saw what happened in the field when Persephone is taken down to hell, and so they sing this song to Demeter to tell her what happened, and that's how she figures out what goes on. So I was like, this is great, because this is an in. Music can be an in. For me as a researcher, music can be an in. It's also just a great plot point to have to figure out how I'm going to move these characters around, and how I'm going to sort of like get some knowledge that a certain character didn't have. How am I going to make a reader understand how they gain that knowledge? It's helpful to have these 2 outside characters, and knowing that they're part of this myth means I can sort of build them into the story. And then, like, very similarly, it comes very late in the novel, but a part of the myth, Persephone myth too, is that Demeter is at a certain point, she's wandering around, and she's in the disguise of an old lady, and she is asking people for alms, and the people who won't give it to her, she's so bitter, she curses them. And of course, the people that do, because she's a goddess, she rewards them. And so she's dressed as an old lady, and she knocks on this door, and another woman opens it, and she gives her food, and the woman sees how depressed Demeter is, and she's trying to figure out how to make her just feel better as another human being, who she believes her to be a human being. And so the woman lifts up her skirts and shows Demeter her bare vagina, essentially, and it makes her laugh, and she finds it hilarious, and she blesses the woman and her household, and it's like this like little pit stop in the story of Persephone. And even that, I was like, well, that's too good not to put into this novel in some sort of way, so I have to figure out a reason for this action to happen, for these characters, and for something to happen around it. And there's a bunch of there's a whole subgenre of Greek statue that is dedicated to that moment, of course, because they're Greek and they're going to be into that. So at one point, when I was in my Radcliffe Fellowship, I was just printing out as many images of these exposed stone vaginas as possible at like 7 o'clock in the morning, like a crazy person, and just pitting them all over my office to help figure out how to write that part of it. So.
Oh my God. I could, now I just want to talk about Demeter and Persephone and like, how they influence all the undertones of this novel. I mean, that is amazing. That is incredible. And like, I did not see that at first, and now I'm like, you dumb. How could you not? It's oh my God. That is oh my gosh. Now I just want to know all about those statues. I guess sort of wrapping up here. The thing that seems to me like one of the big themes of the book is the tension between, you know, the life that's been sort of set out for you to live, and you do your due diligence, and you try to go to the college, and then there's the part of life that sort of sneaks up on you, the sort of part of you that is like awakened by music and that you don't see coming, and it's the part that seems to long for freedom, and often for, I think for Libertie, freedom feels like art, it feels like love, it feels like everything outside of the classroom. She does not want to be a doctor, it turns out. Which very relatable, I thought, as a former pre-med.
Of course it does for you. Yes. Yeah.
I was like, Kaitlyn wrote this book for me, especially for me. I too, but I guess, you know, we often, I mean, to me, like it's this novel is one of those stories that's about like wanting a life that is different from the life that is set out for you. And it's like a sort of quintessential sort of like, I'm gonna go be an artist kind of novel. But what I often feel like is like, Black people don't get to tell those stories because we don't get to do that. Like people think that we don't have a desire to go out and be an artist.
Yeah.
And not only have you written such a novel about a Black person, but a Black woman in like post-Reconstruction America, Kaitlyn.
Yeah.
Like, could you talk about that? Like, just like you wrote the artist novel.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Libertie is in, you know, this novel is indebted in so many ways to Toni Morrison's work, but Libertie in many ways, she's like, you know, there's that line about Sula that she's an artist without a form of art. And so she becomes dangerous. And Libertie is very much like an artist actively looking for the thing that can be her art, and is sort of, you know, the journey that her life takes is that's what she's sort of constantly, that's what leads her to do a lot of the different actions in the novel. And it was really important for me that even though it was going to be set in the 19th century, even though it was going to be set during Reconstruction, that Libertie's biggest challenges weren't necessarily contending directly one-on-one with larger white supremacy or white supremacist violence. And for many of the characters, that's not their biggest contention either. Their contention is how they are going to make communities with each other and what that is actually going to mean. And, you know, who's going to be a part of these communities? How are we going to actually build them? Who's in and who's out? And what do we want to take from what we've just lived through? And what are we going to sort of say we don't want any more of and we want no part of? And so that's like a really fertile ground, of course, for an artist to move through, or for an artist to kind of feel things. And you know, we if you look at our history, we have always produced artists. We've always produced people who are interested in sort of creating stuff, and so our story should be there in every time period. You know, did you watch the HBO documentary on Black art that came out in February?
Okay.
Yeah, it was great, right? And so I that was just such affirmation too, as I was watching it, that we've sort of always sort of found this place. Like when you talk about someone like Dave the Potter, who was he was an enslaved man who made these absolutely gorgeous pots and actually wrote into them, you know, like this was made by Dave the Potter, like wrote little inscriptions into them. They are you know, if you want to go there, they're like an amalgamation of like text and form in like a way that people were not thinking about in 18 whatever when he was doing this thing. You know, and so I think about people like that who even amidst enslavement, you know, were still finding ways to create and express themselves in really innovative, beautiful ways. and that just sort of also gave me, I think, the freedom to imagine that for Liberty. Oh, someone asked what art documentary. There was a HBO had this documentary called the I think it's called The Light Unseen, or it's on HBO Max, and it's an overview of Black art in America, and they talk about a lot of contemporary artists. They talk about artists in the 40s and 50s. It's just like, it's a great introduction to just a huge breadth of that. And then they also talk about like how people collected that art, and there it is, Black art in the absence of light. It's great. I would recommend watching it sometime. But
Yeah, I really loved it. I watched it 3 times. I was
oh
like,
wow.
I was like, let's just run it back. I can't get enough of this. Like, let's run it back. Why not? I mean, it's so good. There's that moment where the main guy, they're like, what do you say to people who say that your art isn't really art, or blah blah blah? And he goes, I would expect that from a so-called mainstream critic. Like, how can you expect anything else from them? But like, they aren't qualified to talk about my work.
Yeah.
Like, yes, you better set the terms of engagement for your own artistry. But I mean, it, in the context of like the novel Liberty, like it's just like so refreshing and so breathtaking. I was just like, ah, yes, I would love to read more novels about Black people being artists in the 1800s. It's like, turns out we were in America in the 19th century and just like doing stuff and not even thinking about white people. So I would love more of that. I mean, it was just really remarkable. I mean, and it's something that sort of grows as the novel goes on, this sort of like roar of Liberty, just like wanting to make shit and just like be free and be an artist. And I'm like, of course that's what she wants. She's a young lady. Of course she wants to be an artist. Yeah, no, it was like truly, truly brilliant. I think we're supposed to start Q&A now.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So everyone put your questions in the box. And we have a question from Pam Gardo, who would like to know, the cover for your book is gorgeous. Is there a story as to how it came about?
Yeah, that's all Algonquin. They had a wonderful illustrator do it. Let me check the credit for him if I can find it. Lorindo Feliciano, and they asked me a little bit about like what would be, I'm not a visual person really in that sort of way. I just said, if she's going to appear on the cover, obviously she has to be dark skinned in some sort of way. And they came, I think at a certain point I said, I made myself a plant Bible of Haiti. I basically just put into Google, like, show me as many pictures of plants that grow in Haiti as possible. And then I made myself like a Google Doc of as many photographs as I could find. And then, as much as I could find information about each of those plants, and then trying to like cross-reference them in homeopathic manuals and stuff. So I had this plant Bible, as I guess is the point of that story. And so I sent it to them. And so some of those plants are definitely on here. And it's just a really gorgeous cover. It looks like it's great. I love it. You can't ask for a better cover than this. So
it's pretty incredible. Like it's also kind of a throwback, I feel, to like an older time and book cover design. Like it feels like one of those covers like out of the 70s or out of the 80s. Like it just feels timeless to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the like the cover trend, of like different stuff coming through. And like I said, I'm not a visual person, so like it's really hard for me to like figure that stuff out, or to like have a discerning opinion on it. But I really love this one. So
yeah, it came out really beautiful. And yeah, you got lucky. Not everybody is that lucky. And some of us have to write 5,000 word emails to our editors about our book covers. While we're waiting for another question, I guess I didn't get to ask about this in the main sort of discussion, but like, and you mentioned it in the context of the cover, but like colorism is like a big theme. I mean, I don't even know if it's like a theme so much as it is like a force in the novel as it is in the world. Were there things about colorism that surfaced in your research that shocked you how it manifested in days of yore? Was it still just fairly contiguous with as we understand it?
I mean, what's interesting is I read this book by this historian named Charles Gatewood. It's called Aristocrats of Color. I highly recommend someone tracking down a copy because it's full of wonderful historical tea about old-timey Reconstruction era people. But he's talking at a certain point about colorism specifically, and he's pointing to these, right after the Civil War, Black communities were setting up newspapers all over the place, all over the country, west, north, east, south, everywhere. There was sort of like this flowering of a Black press. And so the newspaper, he looks at some DC newspapers, and the DC newspapers are like, there's no such thing as colorism. These basically like the subtext is like, these newly emancipated people don't know what they're talking about. Like us people who have been free for a while, like we know there's no such thing as this. Like they're pointing out that there are some poorer, light-skinned people, so that proves that there's no colorism. And then the newspapers that are from sort of like newly emancipated communities, they're like, no, it's clear that colorism is a thing that's going on. There are these people who have appointed themselves as leaders of our community, and they're much lighter skinned, and they don't speak for us. And we can definitely see it in the marriage market. We can see how darker skinned women who are from richer families are less desirable partners than a light skinned woman from whatever family. It gets very messy because they're sort of like being like, if you're poor, you're trash, no matter what color you are. It gets very messy very quickly. It's not PC at all. But it was just so sort of interesting that initial tension of like, does this even exist? Which I think is oftentimes Bumble's conversations had today around it continue. And then Alice Dunbar Nelson, she's a little bit, her life was a little bit later than this novel is set. I'm going to forget the historian who did it, but a historian sort of collected all of her unpublished diaries, which I also suggest anybody tracking down and reading. They are absolutely fascinating. She had all these affairs with women sort of in her social circle, and she also married and dated men. So she's sort of like writing about all these great love affairs that she's having, and she's part of sort of like this DC literary upper crust set. But she came from a poor family, and she was light enough to pass, and that's sort of how she made her way into that world. And in her diary, she's sort of being like, I want to talk about how much I feel oppressed for being light-skinned by other Black people, but I can't actually write about this because everybody would get mad at me. So I'm just gonna have to write about it anonymously. And she does. And when you read her stuff, you're kind of like, I see your point, but also like, I don't know if I'm on board with you. Like it's such a good example of sort of the vagaries of the historical record. I think oftentimes when we talk about, particularly when we talk about Black history, there is a wanting to overlay our own opinions and way of looking at the world on the past. And there's a wanting to, make people in the past very neat and tidy, and their politics very digestible and understandable. And I think once you start sort of talking about colorism, all that stuff blows away because it is involving, class, the politics of desire, all of that stuff that makes things get really messy really quickly.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. I would love an entire set of novels about that. Like Lady Whistle.
Oh my goodness. Yes. There needs to be a Lady Whistledown about like Harlem Renaissance people, like their back and forth, all of their marriages and interesting stuff. My sister, this is a complete aside, this has to do with nothing, but my favorite memory of, my sister's a historian, my favorite memory is we were meeting each other, God, this is the bougiest thing I'm ever gonna say, so please don't hate me for this. We were meeting each other in Martha's Vineyard. I was getting off the ferry. God. We were meeting each other in Martha's Vineyard. I got off the ferry, and the first thing she said to me was, did you know Alain Locke had his mother stuffed? And I was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, Alain Locke, this Harlem Renaissance writer, she's like, he loved his mother so much that when she died, he had her taxidermied, and she would come to Harlem Renaissance cocktail parties, and she would just like be in the room, just like stuffed in the corner. And I was like, how come nobody tells us these things about this? This is completely
Oh,
bonkers. And so anyways, that's what I love about Black history when you get into the craziness of it.
who is gonna pay us to make a Netflix series about this? Because that is incredible. It's like the kind of
Uh,
thing where you're like, wait, what? And then you're like, oh, of course. Like, of course you would too. That is an incredible anecdote. Oh my, I gotta start hanging out with you and your sister. I
oh, you're
gotta.
a blast. She's a treasure trove of crazy historical facts.
Y'all are my people. So here's a question I'm just gonna pluck from the chat here. How would you compare Liberty as a Black female in comparison to other pieces of neo-slave literature or any literature for that matter? How would you compare the protagonists, thinking of Claudia Breedlove, Setha, and etc.?
That's a really good question. I think that Liberty as a protagonist is I like similar to what we were just talking about. I wanted to make her sort of as internally messy as possible, and maybe her dramas are actually pretty small, and there's no sort of like big actions, and that was a choice as well. I wanted sort of her internal life to be really sort of messy around how she moves through the world. And so I think there's a similarity with that with the protagonists you're talking about. Definitely with Setha, I think when you're talking about neo-slave narratives, the potential within them, sort of the power within them, is to explore the consciousness of people who we've been continually told had no consciousness, or had no consciousness besides, the very manicured one that they had to present, slave narratives had to present to white abolitionist readers. Like there's that famous Toni Morrison quote where she's talking about how when you read Frederick Douglass, you can feel the restraint, you can feel the parts where he's censoring himself for an audience. As brilliant as that book is, there's parts where clearly he is not going as deep as he could be, or not bringing things to light that we know he was intelligent enough to notice and understand. And similarly, I think of a huge influence on me, even before Liberty, just as like a piece of writing, was Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I think I read that when I was 14 or 15 years old. In a speaking of artists, I had the great fortune of having the visual artist Layla Ali as one of my literature teachers in high school. And so she had these two classes called the South in Fiction and Film, and the City in Fiction and Film. And in the South in Fiction and Film, we read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I'm always drawn to that book because of its messiness, because that the Linda, or Harriet Jacobs, as she was sort of telling her life story, it gets really messy in terms of her relationships with white men, in addition to sort of the sexual assault that she's experiencing. And the fact that she was brave enough to put both those things into that narrative, both those things onto the page, really, really stuck with me, as I just as a writer, just as like as an inspiration for what truths you can tell, or you should be striving to tell when you write.
Mm. Oh, amazing. Oh my goodness. Here's a question from Martha, and you talked about this a little bit earlier. How connected was your work to Wayward Lives by Sadia Hartman?
Oh, I think that book came out when I was doing the first draft, I think, and I read it. I was also really lucky to, when I was at Radcliffe, the visual artist Jatavia Gary was in my cohort, and so she's done a couple of installations around Sadia Hartman's previous work, and so just being able to talk with her about that text, completely blew my mind. She's a genius level person, just a wonderful, beautiful genius in the world. So that was really just generative and helpful. And that book, I think that book is probably the book of the last like 5 or 10 years. I think when we look back at this period of art making, that book is probably going to be a huge blueprint for so many people and so many works of art and so many different ways that people are approaching stuff.
You know, I feel like it has like remapped my brain. Like I feel like it remapped my brain even before I read it because I had read so many people who had written about reading it. And so when
Mhm.
I was like, ah yes, coming home.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean it's just incredible. It's incredible. I mean,
Mhm.
she's like completely changed the cultural.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's astonishing. What a great mind.
Mhm.
I like this question. What was the most complex, messiest part of the process of writing this novel for you? And what did you learn as a writer from this challenge? Do you think that it will change the way you approach your work, your next book of fiction, if you're working on more fiction?
That's a great question. I think what was, in many ways, writing this novel was different from another thing from writing the first one because I was very fortunate in that I got two back-to-back fellowships, which just allowed the space to actually work on this and to actually do the deep research and have, 4 consecutive days in a row to write through. And so I think the biggest challenge was that knowing even with that sort of support and openness that life still goes on. You still have like really tumultuous, personal life events, and you have to figure out how to keep writing through it. When I was writing We Love You, Charlie Freeman, I used to just always tell myself, like, oh, this would be so much easier if I just was like, had a room, like, the classic Virginia Woolf. If I just like had a room of my own, I could just like bang this out. This would be so much easier. This wouldn't take me, 4 years to write this thing. I could just actually work on it. And, once I got those things, life just also took over, and the discipline to keep writing through it was really difficult to sort of pull up. And so moving forward, I'm just trying to give myself more leeway and more ease with how I work, and forgive myself more for how I turn things out, and just I think really trust where my own artistic instincts are leading me. I think I think if for me, I think one of the biggest things I think for anybody who is sort of embarking in life on a creator is learning to trust your own curiosity, and that the place where your curiosity is leading you is actually going to be helpful, whether or not it results in a novel or a short story or like a finished product. Just the fact that you're following it is going to be helpful. And that is a really hard message to I think keep in mind when so much of how we talk about um, art is around like production and around like finding a straight line from like this thought then led to this thing that then led to selling something for $1 million. And curiosity actually doesn't necessarily work in that straightforward line. I imagine you have the same thing, Brandon, because you have a very quick mind that brings sort of all disparate things all together. And it must be like you have a lot of ideas coming through, and following them, is having the confidence to follow them can be difficult to have, especially as you're starting out, I guess.
Yeah, it impossible. Like it just kind of, I mean, I feel really lucky in that like I live alone. I have a very low overhead. Iowa City is not expensive. And so all I do, like I feel like I have like the perfect set of couple of years to figure out like what I want to do and like what zone do I want to point myself toward.
Yeah.
Because like once you like get on the treadmill of life, like it becomes even more crucial, I think, to preserve that feeling of like curiosity and inquiry and to sort of just like protect that part of it. You said something, I mean, you frequently say brilliant things on Twitter, but you said something especially like really sharp on Twitter the other day where you were just like, what if like your approach to art were rooted in surprise and mystery and being receptive and not in sort of trying to doggedly police genre and demarcation? Like what if you treated art as though it were like this wide open space and not just like a set of fiefdoms that you're gonna piss over and claim as your own? And I'm like, man, Kaitlyn, like really, really yet again saving my life.
I think it's especially in a place like Twitter where people make up these nonsensical wars of genre of like, which I don't think mirrors how 99% of the population thinks about literature or reading. You know, I think the percentage of the population that's like, you know, I could never read a romance novel because I just read a Jane Austen book is probably like extremely slim. And those people, you know, you wouldn't want to hang around with anyways. So like the idea that this is like some sort of monolith of culture and receiving stuff is, I think, a little bit misguided, and I think is fun for stirring up Twitter controversies, but isn't really a generative question. And it's definitely not how the vast majority of people interact with literature and books and reading. You know, I think people are, it's more likely that someone is a promiscuous reader or, you know, open to other things. And I think it is that, you know, the quintessential idea of like, you know, there's that old guy who only reads Tom Clancy books and you know, he's just in a corner or whatever. Those people exist. I'm not saying that they don't, but you know, I think as likely as not that person reading a Tom Clancy book might also pick up a Brandon Taylor novel and think nothing of it. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that like whenever I get into these arguments, and it's whenever I get into these fights with literary people, I'm like, okay, but like book people, like people who read on airplanes, do not care about your magical realism, like your whole unified Barthian theory of the deconstructed narrative. They're just like, yeah, this slaps. I'm gonna turn some pages
Right.
and see what shakes out. And that's the thing that like, whenever I'm getting too heady in writing, I'm always like, okay, but like, what would a person on an airplane think about this? Would they be like, what great technique, or would they be like, I don't understand this?
Yeah, and I think people assume that means that you're somehow like dumbing down your book, but I don't think that at all. And I would point to this, you know, we are in such a rich period for literature, but the fact that like, you know, Laura Vandenberg or Carmen Maria Machado have dedicated readers and fans and, you know, sell books regularly tells me that, you know, readers are interested and capable and willing to follow books that are doing absolutely astounding things on the page at the same time that they're going to read something else. So
Yeah, it's all exciting. It's so, but then I think about, and maybe, yeah, but then I think about like maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, it felt like there was the one big Black book by a Black woman that got to come out,
yeah,
and everybody, all the white people would be like, oh yes, clap, 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 clap.
yeah.
And then they'd go away. And then all the other books that were brilliant by these young Black women would go sort of unheralded. And not that any of that has anything to do with the quality of the work, and of course it doesn't.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that it's been really beautiful to see finally we can support a raft of these incredible writers all
Yeah.
at the same
Yeah.
time.
I
And
I feel like that is 100% the internet. That's 100% social media that has made that abundantly clear, I think, to everybody. That these books can have the multiple conversations about these books can be happening all over the place. That you know, the assumption that the only place you can have a conversation about books is in the New York Times Book Review or in the New Yorker is not true. And I think those publications would welcome that not being true. Like those publications, you know, I think get a lot of their content from the fact that we're having conversations elsewhere and they're able to, you know, just like chime in and sort of like have an opinion. So I think it's much more, you know, expansive than people give it credit for. But
yeah, it feels like I mean, we've always been the moment, but like it feels like now other people are finally clued into the fact that we are the moment. Um, but it's been really beautiful. And like so many of the conversations about your book especially have just been like, I'm like, yeah, absolutely, that's right, Kaitlyn Greenidge is a genius. This book is an American classic. We should all be reading it all the time. It's been really beautiful. And you know, like the part of me that isn't, you know, sort of cynical or whatever, it's just like, yes, finally we are clued in that Black women, that like Black women can write brilliant books, and there can be more than one at a time, and we can give everybody the shit they deserve.
Yes, yeah, agreed.
Amazing. Well, I think that's all of the question. Well, it's not all the questions, but I think it's past time, and I don't want to like impinge further upon your time.
No. Well, I could talk all night. This has been wonderful. And also thank you to everybody who's in the audience who have been, I wish I could reply to the chat at the same time. I don't have those capabilities. My ADD powers have dulled with age, so I can't actually do that at the moment. But thank you for, keeping up a robust conversation in the chat and for coming out. This was really lovely. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you. Love these questions.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it was a pleasure. I mean, we gotta kick it about these Persephone Demeter statues. We gotta.
Oh,
I'll
send you all my photos.
There should be like a compendium. You should talk to Algonquin to like make like a compendium of your research materials, because I think people would pay for that. The people want to know. The people want to know. But yes, thank you for being so generous with your time and your answers. And thanks everybody for coming. It was a blast.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this incredible conversation. I dreamed it would be amazing, and it was even more amazing. And thank you to everybody who's here tonight. If you haven't yet gone off and read either Libertie or Real Life, please go and do that with the rest of your evening. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye. Thanks a bunch.